In the year of our Lord 2025, I confessed to my few confidants that in some odd way I felt like Nostradamus. You know, the guy from the 16th century who made all of the predictions that some believe were still coming true back then. I always followed up with this disclaimer. I don't actually think I can predict the future. It's just that, given the trends that seem so apparent to me, I think I can make an educated guess at it. Some understood where I was coming from, even when they disagreed with the conclusions I drew from the chirons. You know, the tiny headlines that endlessly scrolled along the bottom of the screen during every CNN broadcast. You know, the rolling headlines that were always overshadowed by the persistent breaking news banner that never seemed to have an off switch. Others simply thought that I'd lost my mind, and I had, just not in the way they assumed. For those people, I would always explain how I viewed the future. I would say something like, "It just seems like the signs so many of us are looking for are already there. They're always there. They're warning us that something bad is coming, something that we won't be able to stop." This, of course, was when I'd lose most of my audience, especially those who had been exposed to my incessant personal and internal breaking news banner. I couldn't turn it off. I couldn't silence the warning sirens in my head. I needed to share what I thought should have been apparent to so many, but was instead utterly elusive. In those days, my motto was, "Those who ignored the plight of others is doomed to suffer their fate." Of course, I knew this was not an original thought and that others had said it more eloquently than I had, but it still felt like something that needed to be said, something that needed to be repeated, because in all honesty, I don't think anyone was listening. At least not until things got turned up. The rhetoric, the lies, the propaganda, the chaos, it all got turned up until the narratives could no longer stand when juxtaposed against reality. Too bad it took so long for people to realize that life did not have to be dictated by those at the top. And by top, I mean in the very narrow way that only money and capitalism can place someone or a very small group of someone's at the top. Not the authoritarians on your homeowners association, not your county commissioners, state representatives, or even those at the national level of your government. The only peak that the cohort of which I speak could reach was the peak of corruption. And like reaching the top of a mountain like Everest, those who strove for the summit had to step over a bunch of dead bodies and even more feces to get there. And, as some say, it's the journey that's important, not the destination. This could not have been more relevant than in the aughts or the decade starting in the year 2000. All those candidates in leadership roles had to do then was to thrive in a system where the only requirement was to be more corrupt than the competition. At that time, failing up felt more like a pastime for our elected officials than something to avoid at all costs. It was the rule, not the exception, and it was one of the primary characteristics that allowed mediocrity and greed to thrive. After all, there are only two reasons why the best candidates for the presidency of the United States were Joe Biden, a demented man well past his expiration date, and Donald Trump, a billionaire that the middle class and so many poor people thought would save them from the corruption that money birthed and nurtured. One of the two possible shifts that occurred at that time were: nothing more than mediocrity was expected of the world's leaders, or our universe bumped up against a parallel dimension, and this one ended up with a populace that couldn't tell the difference between words and deeds, truths and lies. Back then, I would have had to split any bets I made between the two options presented in the last couple of sentences evenly, because both seemed as viable and both made more sense than the ignorance exhibited then. I would say hindsight is 20/20, but a plurality kept voting for the two parties that had overseen the collapse of the richest nation the world had ever known. Living in Miami at that time, all I witnessed was mediocrity. America had become land of the financed and home of the broke. Miami itself, once self-described as the sexiest city in the world, lost that moniker when all the sexy people left for greener pastures. There was just no longer enough gold to dig out of them their hills. There was little else to do other than work in order to pay for rent or property taxes or buy food or gas. That city, which at one time in the 80s offered events like festivals, parades, art shows, and more, every week became a place with fewer, if any, amenities for the residents unless you made a lot of money. The leaders of that city stopped trying to improve the lives of their constituents and began taxing its residents for the sunshine, because it didn't offer much more than good weather. Just one more resource created by nature only to be commodified by those whose constituents' misguided belief and misplaced trust allowed failure to persist without accountability for far too long. Though not a catalyst for humanity's downfall, one of the most prominent and perplexing signs of the unavoidable end of American hegemony was a simple tattoo, its prominence apparent to any and all survivors of the Nazi regime. While its perplexing nature less so, as so many failed to see the correlation between the tattoos utilized during the Holocaust and those implemented in the 21st century. It all started with chips embedded under the skin of our dogs and cats. A fitting beginning for a system used by the smallest on minorities who viewed the rest of us as pets. After the pets were chipped, it was suggested that chips be inserted in one's child as a means for parents to monitor their offspring's whereabouts. You know, in case of a kidnapping. What could go wrong? No one asked as hacking became a sport. After all, the belief then was that the thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of Microsoft computer nerds could stave off the attacks of the millions of hackers around the globe. Google programmers were the perfect levy to resist the pressure of millions of black and white hat hackers who thought Google had abandoned its core value of do no harm years beforehand, especially since it changed its very slogan or motto of ethics from "Don't be evil" to "Do the right thing." Though subtle, the former objectively encompasses all behavior that could be construed as evil, while the latter leaves the interpretation up to the subjectivity of the employee. Do the right thing could be limited to what is best for the company. Evil is evil. As for the chips that our leaders sought to inject into us, those didn't take off outside of being used to track animals. I mean animals not also categorized as human. It might have been an inherent fear of giving our government one more means to track our every movement, or it could have simply been bad marketing. Where there was a will, however, there was a way, especially when there was the possibility of profit. As long as there was more than one dog, there was another dog to be eaten. And late-stage capitalism demanded a sacrifice. It just so happened that, in this case, that sacrifice would be mankind itself. Just as a very large percentage of Earth's population had to forego their right to bodily autonomy during the COVID-19 pandemic, which it turned out was man-made. Most humans around the globe were forced to take a vaccine that manufacturers lied about. Well, not physically forced to take the vaccine, everyone was threatened with a loss of income, which under capitalism meant a loss of almost everything. Things like food, shelter, and clothing would continue to be accessible to everyone in the United States, as long as you injected an experimental medicine in your veins. You could continue working to pay to eat and drink and avoid exposure to the elements because capitalism was not very charitable near the end. In all honesty, it was the exact opposite of charitable when everything hit the fan. And therein lies the reason so many people were willing to accept something that Hitler and his followers instituted. At first, tracking every American began with this thing called the Real ID. That was a card that you carried in your wallet or purse. With that, they could know your whereabouts anywhere in the country, probably the world. The problem with the driver's license or passport with a chip in it was that the person of interest could leave that electronic leash at home. There goes the tacit control they had over you. They couldn't tell exactly where you were for the half hour it took to run to the grocery store and back home to get the wallet you forgot at home. That they just could not tolerate. They had to monitor you at all times. And cameras alone would not suffice. Enter the tattoo, your own personal QR code. The perfect way for one to never have to carry identification or money. Your whole life could be stored on your arm on an area less than 1 inch square. Your bank accounts in the flesh. Literally. Your prescriptions available by simply stretching out your hand. Everything that made you you drawn on your wrist as proof that you mattered. What many who got the tattoo failed to consider was what would happen when they no longer mattered. I don't mean mattered in the eyes of their mother or father or other family members or friends. I mean mattered in the eyes of the government. Those who willingly got tattooed failed to question what would happen to the bank accounts or their medicine when they pissed off the wrong person or group. It failed to register that what happened to a group of Canadian truckers who protested being forced to get injected with an experimental medicine could happen to anyone with a government-approved tattoo distributed by a private corporation. No money for you because you voted for the other guy. No food for you because you didn't properly recycle your cans or paper products. No medicine for your daughter because your property taxes weren't paid on time. Your car not only won't start today, but we're going to have it drive away autonomously with all your worldly possessions. You can live on the streets like all of those other deadbeats. The tattoo was presented as an answer to identity theft, because one that wasn't within the temperature range of an average human body could not be used at the fast food kiosks or at a bank. ATM. If only those unscrupulous hackers hadn't figured out a way to keep those tattoos warm after they were cut off, the class action lawsuits could have been minimized. Ultimately, this didn't even deter the proliferation of tattoos. The designs were infinite, and artificial intelligence ensured that the newest tattoo recipient was pleased with their new virtual leash. In the end, the tattoos were just one more way in which the rich could get richer while the rest of society languished in poverty and debt. The tattoos were yet one more reason for Americans to lose faith in their homeland. The tattoos made it easy for other nations to chip away at those things that at one time made America the dream. They were just one more nail in the coffin.